Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? First of all, I want to thank everybody for being brave and coming out today. I'd also like to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Lauren Gross, and I'm the director of the Gross Family Center for the Study of Antisemitism and the Holocaust. I would like to just make a note that this season, because of COVID, we made the decision not to do Zooming because personally I felt that Zooms are somewhat problematic in that they keep the community still apart, and I felt strongly that it was time after 10 months. As you may remember, we were amongst the first organizations to shut down last March. So I felt it was time for us to try to reassemble as a community. In light of that, we will be live recording each one of our events this abbreviated season. So at the end of Irving's remarks, I would ask you to please give him 5 seconds of applause so that we can professionally end the recording, and then we will go to a Q&A. Okay? I would also ask that everybody who needs to use the restroom during the performance, or if your phone rings, you need to take an emergency call, to please not walk down the center aisle, but please use the side aisles so the camera doesn't get, the speaker is not obscured by you walking through the front of the camera. Okay. The son of Holocaust survivors, Dr. Irving Berkowitz is a widely respected scholar and public speaker on the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism. He has served as Dean of Academic Affairs at Palm Beach State College since 2013. In 2016, Dr. Berkowitz was awarded a Holocaust Fellowship to the Harvard of Holocaust Studies, the prestigious International School of Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem, where he was a scholar in residence. In 2018, Dr. Berkowitz completed a fellowship as a scholar in residence at Oxford University's renowned Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, with a small group of the brightest minds in the world devoted to advancing our knowledge of the roots and ramifications of global anti-Semitism. Dr. Berkowitz has received numerous commendations, including the 2019 Martin Luther King Jr. Distinguished Leadership Award for a lifetime of leadership, scholarship, advocacy, and service in relation to racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and discrimination. I'm very proud to call him a dear friend, a Gross Family Center board member. He is a towering figure in his field, and it is my greatest honor and privilege to welcome back Dr. Irving Berkowitz to kick off our 5th season of Speaker Series in the Palm Beaches. Thank you.
I am the son of Holocaust survivors. My mother and father lost all members of their families and extended families, and like 75% of all Holocaust survivors, they were the sole survivors of their entire families. So thank you once again, Paul and Lauren, for your great efforts in continuing to meet the challenge of promoting Holocaust education and compliance with a state statute mandating Holocaust education in the schools. So let me talk about the subject of today's talk, living with the sins of their fathers, the children of Nazi war criminals. I have spoken for years on the subject of the Holocaust survivors, but never have I spoken on the subject of the children, the progeny, the descendants of Nazi war criminals. Imagine what it must be like finding out at some point that the father that you revered, the father you adored, the father that many of these children enshrined in their homes with photos from room to room. Imagine learning that they were genocidal monsters. I've given you a list of questions. I will not be addressing those until later on, but I want you to look at those as you listen to this talk. We're going to be focusing today, and I hope within the time that I'm allotted, I can address all of the leaders that I've studied for the past year. I have been steeped in research, not only on the scope and the magnitude, the gravity of the heinous war crimes committed by these Nazis, but how their children coped very differently with the knowledge of their atrocities. Atrocities that were unparalleled in human history. Let's start with the idea that all children are influenced by their forefathers. I will take that a step further and say that it's not just children and families, but indeed entire nations that are influenced by their forefathers. And these children, the children of Nazi leaders, these children were at a tender age, no doubt, ignorant, innocent, unaware of the dastardly, heinous deeds of their fathers. They grew up in powerful families, a privileged life, but they were unaware until a point was reached where they had been confronted with the realities of their father's misdeeds. All children are affected by their forefathers, and these children were as well. What then do we mean by the sins of the fathers? Why did I choose this title for this talk? There is a biblical origin to the phrase, the sins of the fathers. Excuse me. We find that in the Old Testament, it says that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon their children for 3 to 4 generations. You have in Deuteronomy, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children. This was an evolutionary change in God's judgment of people. He said, the Lord is slow to anger and of great mercy, forgiving the iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their children. But there comes a time in the Old Testament where Hashem says that it is the children will only suffer the sins of their fathers if they perpetuate their fathers' sins. The question is, if the children can inherit the sins of their fathers, can they also inherit the seeds of sin from their fathers? And this too is something that Hashem deals with in the Old Testament. Think about the guilt that was placed upon the son of Noah's son Ham, what's called the curse of Ham, that was placed upon his son Canaan. Think about Abraham when Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. It was the children, it was the descendants of those who were wicked that paid the price. But things change, and we'll talk about how that change occurs later. Let's start with one of the Nazi leaders, a face that you wouldn't know, this one posed here. This is the commandant of the Plaszow camp in Krakow, Poland. If you saw the film Schindler's List, this is the infamous Amon Goeth. I don't know how many of you did, but if you did, then you could not have been unaffected by the utter ruthlessness of this commandant. Amon Goeth was in charge of the Plaszow camp, and here are the dimensions: 197 acres, 180 barracks, 150,000 prisoners that were processed, and Amon Goeth, under his management of this concentration camp, was held responsible for the deaths of 81,500 people. I'm showing you this slide because I want you to see to what extent Steven Spielberg went to authenticate his portrayal of the Plaszow concentration camp and its evil commandant. Look at this first slide here. Is Amon Goeth holding his rifle, and this is the actor Ralph Fiennes portraying him, standing on his balcony doing what Amon Goeth would eventually be convicted for, which was a daily routine of shooting prisoners. Even in the film, Steven Spielberg had the same dogs that were owned, not the same, but the same kind of dogs owned, trained to tear prisoners apart, and watching this happen. Here you have an image of a mass murder site. 10,000 Jews were murdered here at the order of Amon Goeth, the commandant. This is the memorial in Poland today. This is an image from the movie Schindler's List just to illustrate how Amon Goeth daily enjoyed shooting prisoners. And one particular day during the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, Amon Goeth personally was responsible for the murder of 90 women and children. And here then are the images, one from Schindler's List in the middle and the one on the far right showing the hanging of Amon Goeth in 1945, immediately after he was captured. So what we have now then are the people related to Amon Goeth. The woman on the far left, that would be Ruth Calder. She was a model, a beautician. She was the mother of Monica, the daughter of Amon Goeth. The mother and daughter hated each other. The mother never hugged her. The mother never, ever allowed the daughter, to call her mom. Monica, the woman in the center, the daughter of Amon Goeth, and Ruth Calder, the daughter referred to her mother by her first name, Ruth. The mother eventually would commit suicide, but not before she would relinquish custody of Monica to her grandmother. And it was said that Monica would ask her mother, "Where is my father? Do I have a father?" To which Ruth would respond by saying, "Your father died. Your father died like millions of other soldiers did for his country." Monica always believed that until one day, just before being relinquished to her grandmother, Ruth Calder, in a fit of anger, said to her daughter Monica, "You know, one day you too will die just like your father did." And Monica simply couldn't understand that because she had known nothing about her father. And when she raised this question with her grandmother, she said, "What did my mom mean? What did she mean by saying that I would die as my father did?" And it was then that her grandmother told her, "Your father was hanged. He was hanged for killing Jews." Monica couldn't believe it. And believe it or not, it was only when Monica went into a theater and watched the movie Schindler's List that she learned all that she could about her father and his brutality. She, watching that film, was particularly moved by one scene in the film, if you can recall this, the scene during which a Jewish woman, an architect in charge of constructing a building, informs Amon Goeth that there were imperfections in the structure and that it had to be redone. It was at that point that Amon Goeth says to the Jewish woman, the architect, he says, at first he orders the soldier to go ahead and shoot her. And the woman looks at him and says, "But sir, I'm only doing my job." Do you remember this in the film? She says, "I'm only doing my job." And Amon Goeth's response is, "So am I." It was this part of the film that so affected Monica Goeth. But it doesn't end there. Monica lives her entire life having to cope with the knowledge of her father's brutality, and at one point gets married, but she marries a Nigerian guy, and the woman to the far right here is Monica Goeth's daughter, Jennifer Teague, and as you can see, Jennifer Teague would end up learning that it was her grandfather who was a mass murderer, and so writes the book that my grandfather would have shot me. Why? Because she's black. If you'll recall in the film, in Schindler's List, that Amon Goeth has this, not an affair, he has this assistant, Helen, that was portrayed in the film, who was assaulted almost daily, physically and sexually. And it was Helen that Monica would eventually, 50 years later, Monica would reach out and Monica and Helen would have a talk, and it was Helen that informed Monica that her father liked to shoot women with babies in their arms only to see if one bullet could kill two of them. This is the memorial outside of the Plaszow concentration camp. And now we go to the next evil Nazi, the infamous angel of death, Josef Mengele, the one man who died in 1979, having escaped from Germany to Argentina with the help of the International Red Cross. Yes. But there's a story behind this. Josef Mengele, as you know, was the man responsible for the medical, what he called experiments. This was, of course, not science, because in science, experimental subjects are voluntary. His subjects were not. This was the infamous Block 10. I've been there many times, where these heinous experiments were conducted. And these are illustrations, images of some of the experiments. 3,000 sets of twins that were subjected to the most inhumane treatment. Children that were frozen to death, that had their arms, their limbs broken to test their tolerance for pain. Roma, gypsy children had dye injected into their eyes to see if they could be changed to blue eyes. And they were, in some cases, they were treated, they were cut up to be given wounds that were supposed to approximate the wounds that soldiers would suffer in the field. So they would cut them open and rub dirt and metal inside the wounds just to see how those wounds could be treated if this were to happen to a soldier. And then, of course, that horrible image of twins being sewn together. This is Josef Mengele in the 1970s, enjoying life in Argentina. But Josef Mengele had a son. And before I get to that, I do have to remind you, I just remembered a story. Josef Mengele, when he left Auschwitz, he was captured and imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp. It didn't take long for him to get some assistance to escape from the camp, and he escaped to Bavaria. And he found refuge on a farm that grew potatoes. Now listen to this. His task on that potato farm was to sort the potatoes, separating those potatoes that were suitable for cooking from those potatoes that were unfit for human consumption and relegated to animal feed. What an ironic contrast to the role that Josef Mengele played on the railway platform as trains of 6,000 Jews mostly came to Auschwitz, and Josef Mengele sat in judgment of who would live and who would not. This was the man that chose to send most of my family to the gas chambers and crematoria. Josef Mengele had a son. Rolf did not know his father. It's alleged that they met once in Switzerland when he was 12 years old, but met later on, one and only other time, when he traveled to Argentina. He met with his father and he had this conversation. His son, Rolf, said to his father, "Your presence in Auschwitz alone, as anything but a prisoner, is unacceptable to me." And this is what Josef Mengele said to him: "Don't tell me that you, my only son, believe what they write about me. On my mother's life, I have never hurt anyone." And when questioned about the twins that were experimented on, he said, "Oh, as to the twins in the camp, they owe their lives to me. I personally never harmed anyone." Can you imagine saying that the twins that he experimented on, 85% of whom died in these experiments, they owed their lives to him? And why? He said to his son, because he spared them from the gas chamber. And the last thing his son said was, "I realize that my father would never express any remorse or any feeling of guilt." Let's go on to talk about another monster, Adolf Eichmann. What you see here in the middle is a falsified passport. Thank you again, International Red Cross. Yes, the International Committee of the Red Cross issued this document, allowing Adolf Eichmann also to escape to Argentina. And this is a quote directly from Adolf Eichmann. This is a quote he made after he was captured by the Israeli Mossad in 1960. He was tried in 1961, and he was hanged in 1962, and his body cremated, his ashes distributed in the Red Sea. This is what Adolf Eichmann said: "I will leap into my grave laughing, because the feeling that I have 5 million human beings on my conscience is for me a source of extraordinary satisfaction. You should know a little more about Adolf Eichmann. This was a man in 1933 who was head of the Department of Jewish Affairs in Germany. He did everything he could to study and understand Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish theology. He considered himself an expert on Jewish affairs. As a matter of fact, at his trial, Adolf Eichmann said that he was absolutely not an anti-Semite. And why? Because he said he had a greater interest in Jews than he had in Arabs. He said he never read Mein Kampf. He never read the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a Jewish conspiracy theory. But he did read The Jewish State by Theodor Herzl, the founder of the modern state of Israel. This was, you must know, the man that was the genocide strategist, the engineer, the mastermind, the carpenter, and the executioner of the final solution. Adolf Eichmann. This picture that you see in front of you is a famous picture of all those men who attended a famous meeting in January 1942. And it was at that time that Adolf Eichmann produced, this was the location, the Wannsee Conference, and it was Adolf Eichmann that produced this document. You're seeing an image of the original document that Adolf Eichmann produced. This is his estimate from a year worth of research on the number of Jews by country that could be targeted for extermination. By country, 11 million Jews. So I told you he was captured, he was tried in Israel, and he was found guilty and hanged. And before he was hanged, he said this: to sum it all up, I must say, I regret nothing. Repentance is for little children. But Adolf Eichmann had children. Oh, and before I get to the children, I want to show you this article. In 1943, this is a New York Times article on the left. That article reports, if you can read that, it says, Germans wipe out the Jews of Austria. The subtext says, almost all of the original 200,000 Jews have been killed or sent to the east, eastern ghettos. Ladies and gentlemen, you must understand that there was a policy change from 1940 to 1943. The policy change was a change from what to do with the Jews, either to force immigration, and the forced immigration was intended, at least targeted, to be to Siberia, where no one could survive, or, I don't know how many you've heard of this, of the Madagascar plan. There was actually a plan to force immigration of Jews, all Jews in Europe, to the island of Madagascar. That policy changed. It changed with the final solution that came about as a result of this Wannsee Conference. The change was from immigration to what they called evacuation. And evacuation, ladies and gentlemen, meant nothing more or less than extermination. Evacuation to the death camps in the east. So here is the arrogant and unremorseful Adolf Eichmann. And this is a letter that he wrote days before his execution. This arrogant guy now claiming that he was nothing but an instrument. He was nothing but an obedient bureaucrat. That he didn't make the policy decisions, he merely carried the decisions out. And as you all well know, this became a popular defense of most of the Nazi war criminals during the Nuremberg trials. I only followed orders, which raises the question, and I want you to think about this, the question of whether or not you know people today who would blindly obey authority and simply carry out whatever they are ordered to. You bet. Major research I'm not going to get into now in the 1960s by a famous Stanford psychology professor called Obedience to Authority. And believe it or not, in this experiment, everybody did what they were told to do, knowing that they were administering an unbearable punishment to somebody else. So here is the man who claimed that he was merely doing what he was told to do, and that was his defense. He was not a responsible leader. Therefore, he asks the president of Israel at the time to commute his sentence, not put him to death. This story about the Jews of Austria, I'm telling you this because Adolf Eichmann boasted about the fact that he made Austria Judenfrei, meaning that he eliminated all of the Jews of Austria, and bragged about that, proud of that accomplishment. And in his final days, I just had to put this picture up because in his final days, Adolf Eichmann spent walking, pacing behind barbed wire like a caged animal in much the way his victims did. And I want you to look at that image to the far left because you've got to know that's an image of the 3 layers of electrified fencing around Auschwitz. And here's what Adolf Eichmann had to say about children. Listen carefully. It is especially the children who have to be killed first, because where is the logic in killing a generation of older people and leaving alive a generation of young people who can be possible avengers of their parents and constitute a new biological cell for the reemergence of this people? This is a quote taken from a letter that he wrote to the Commandant of Auschwitz, making it a priority for children to be murdered first. And you must know this, that there were 232,000 Jewish children sent to Auschwitz. 232,000 Jewish children were sent to Auschwitz. 96% of them perished. But Adolf Eichmann had children. He had 4 sons. 3 of those sons were born in Europe, Austria, and Germany. On the left, you see Horst, who died. You see in the middle Dieter, who is still alive, and Klaus Eichmann, who died as well. In fact, Horst and Klaus died in the same year, 2015. But it was Ricardo Eichmann who was the sole remorseful son. He was born in Argentina. He was 1 year old, only 1, when his father was captured by the Mossad and taken to Israel. But it was the 3 sons that responded with such hatred and such denial about the, quote, kidnapping of their father, that when their father was taken to Israel, they started flying flags with swastikas on them outside their homes. When their father was finally executed, they got their neo-Nazi group to plan for the attack of Jews in Argentina and the destruction of Jewish businesses. Ricardo Eichmann, interestingly, has the name that his father took as an alias. His father, when he traveled to Argentina, took the name of Ricardo Clement. Oh, and by the way, Ricardo was the one, unlike so many other children that had to deal with this, with the stain on their ancestry. It was Ricardo that actually spent the time to look at the deportation orders that his father signed. It was Ricardo that in public statements would say, I saw these documents. I cannot say it didn't happen. I know it did. Here you have an image of two of the top Nazi leaders. The guy on the right, I'm not going to be talking, I would, but if I had more time. Reinhard Heydrich was the one who organized the Wannsee Conference. And oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, Adolf Eichmann at that Wannsee Conference was the man that was responsible for taking the minutes or the protocols of that conference. And it was Adolf Eichmann that produced that document that I projected earlier. That document, by the way, is considered one of the most damaging documents that was used against the Nazis tried in the Nuremberg trial. Reinhard Heydrich, the guy on the right, very brutal, was the man that they call the overseer of the final solution. And the man to the left, Herman Goering, was the number 2 Nazi in all of Germany. And here I just wanted, I'm sure you can't read that now, but I just wanted for you to see where the phrase, the final solution to the Jewish question, comes. In this letter, and the one on the right is written in German, the one on the left is translated into English. And in the red portion, you will see that Herman Goering, the man shaking the hand of Reinhard Heydrich, is saying, I herewith commission you to carry out all the necessary preparations for a final solution to the Jewish question. Ladies and gentlemen, Operation Heydrich, that conference was in January 1942. Only months later was the only Nazi leader, high-ranking Nazi leader, assassinated. Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated. Soon after that, Adolf Hitler, to punish the Jews for his assassination, even though they were not Jewish, the two assassins, Adolf Hitler ordered the murder of 10,000 people in one city, Jewish people in one city, and that was Lidice. And in fact, that was carried out in 2 cities. So this is Herman Goering, and this is what he had to say. God gave the Savior to the German people. We have faith, deep and unshakable faith, that he, Adolf Hitler, was sent to us by God to save Germany. You must know that Hitler did think of himself as the Mashiach. He did. He was deified. And people were indoctrinated to deify him. Something I want to tell you before I forget is that the Hitler Youth, if you've known anything about it, Hitler Youth was created in 1933 as a response to the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts, founded in 1909, the Boy Scouts was Hitler's idea, Hitler Youth, of taking young, especially young men, but men and women, and thoroughly indoctrinating them, making them, instilling in them a fealty to the Fuhrer. They were absolutely taken from their families, from their parents, and they were taught an unabiding loyalty to Hitler. In 1933, there were 50,000 Hitler Youth. In 1934, 1 year later, there were 6 million Hitler Youth. And so you have to wonder about the children of Nazi leaders, because they too were indoctrinated, all to believe that Adolf Hitler was placed there by God to save Germany. This is Herman Goering at the Nuremberg trial, completely apathetic, unapologetic. And this is the image of Herman Goering after the Nuremberg trial. He was found guilty, sentenced to be hanged, and of course, in a day, he swallowed a cyanide pill. But look at what he has to say. This is something he said before. He said, "I especially denounce the terrible mass murders which I cannot understand." Remember the letter I just read to you that came from him. "I have never ordered any killings or tortures anywhere, even if I had the power to prevent such. It must have been Himmler who thought up these stupid experiments." And then he goes on to say, and Himmler shirked his responsibility by committing suicide. He accuses Himmler of shirking responsibility by committing suicide when he himself did. But Herman Goering had a daughter, Edda Goering. And by the way, you must know that Herman Goering was the one Nazi that was responsible for pilfering hundreds of millions of dollars of art from all over Europe. His villa was loaded with precious art, and Edda Goering was actually given a gift by her father of one of these pieces by Rembrandt, and believe it or not, there would come a time long after her father was gone where she actually sued Germany to reclaim art that was stolen by her father. She thought that this was something she was entitled to. Edda Goering was just another one, a poster child for the Third Reich. Look at this image of her and Adolf Hitler on the left. And I don't know if you can see this very well, I'm sorry for it, but Edda Goering was called the Shirley Temple of Nazi Germany. So I found this image of Shirley Temple. I'm sure you've seen this before, of her saluting, as well as Edda Goering. Edda Goering was the poster child of the Nazi regime. Edda Goering grew up never believing that her father committed such atrocities. She also was one that enshrined her father with images everywhere. She was a founder of an organization called in German the Stille Hilfe, the silent, literally translated to mean silent help. Edda Goering was one that participated in providing whatever relief she could to convicted Nazi war criminals. She also grew up being a poster child for the neo-Nazi movement in Germany. These are images of her. She died completely unrepentant and angry at Germany for not restoring the art that she received from her father, who stole it. But now we have a great niece of Herman Goering, and this is an astonishing story. Bettina Goering never gave interviews about her great uncle, But what she did was utterly astonishing. She and her brother both decided that they would become sterilized out of fear that they carried an evil gene. An evil gene. And this was it. This is her picture, and this is exactly her words. I had my tubes tied at age 30 because I feared that I would create another monster. And so did my brother. Now we come to Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the commandant of Auschwitz. This man admitted to being responsible at the Nuremberg trial. He said that according to his documents, his count, that 4 million people were killed at Auschwitz. As you know, that number has been revised downward, not 4 million. Right now, scholars pretty much agree that the total number murdered at Auschwitz is in the range of 1.5 to 2 million. 1.1 to 1.3 million, the vast majority of them Jews. And here are some facts I want you to know about Auschwitz. It's become the centerfold. It's ground zero of the Holocaust, the largest and deadliest of all extermination camps. 7 gas chambers and 52 ovens in 5 crematoria. 1.3 to 1.1 million Jews, almost 25,000 gypsies, 75,000 Poles. They are saying that 1 in 6 Jews that perished in the Holocaust died at Auschwitz. Auschwitz is built, I don't know if you've been there, I have, built on 20,000 acres of land. Whatever homes or structures were there were bulldozed to make room for 300 barracks, and each barrack containing as many as 2,000 people in a barrack made for 500. 8,400 staff, but look at this. Only 673 staff were charged with war crimes. 3,000 victims were gassed per hour. 7 gas chambers, ladies and gentlemen. 7 gas chambers with a capacity of 1 to 2,000 in each gas chamber. They said that when the gas chambers were open, people were standing because they couldn't fall. They were dead standing. 60,000 Jews were marched on the death march as the Russians were approaching Auschwitz. 15,000 of those died. And 350 Jewish children were still found alive at Auschwitz upon its liberation. This is what one barrack looked like. Try and imagine 2,000 people in this barrack. You see these bunks? One level was for 8 people. 8 people. So 4 with their heads on one side, 4 with their heads on the other side. This is what it looked like. No heat. This is the Auschwitz facts. This is the 1.1 million Jews, and this is where they came from. If you're interested in this, I'll be glad to provide it to you later. So this is what he had to say. Rudolf Hess was the man who claimed, like Adolf Eichmann, to be only a bureaucrat, to say that he didn't make the policy decisions. Yet this was the man that on one day ordered 800 people who were too sick to go to work to stand outside in their prison garb, and the temperature was 5 below zero. 800 of them stood outside, and almost 200 died of exposure. I commanded Auschwitz and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were executed, 2.5 million, executed there by gassing and burning, making a total. He goes on to say that in addition to those that succumbed to starvation and so on, that it might have been close to 3 million people. And so this is an image of his hanging. And oh, by the way, he was hung outside of the crematorium. What you're looking at, that structure on the right, is the crematorium. He was hung in front of the crematorium. And this is what he had to say. Hitler gave me the order to prepare the installations at Auschwitz where mass exterminations could take place. It was certainly an extraordinary and monstrous order. Nevertheless, he thought the reason seemed right to him. The killing, he says, was easy. You didn't even need guards to drive them into the gas chamber. They just went in expecting to take a shower, and instead of water, we turned on the poison gas. The whole thing went fairly quickly. And so Rudolf Höss, oh, by the way, this is the same man that was responsible for the murder of 450,000 Hungarian Jews in May, from May to July 1944. And ladies and gentlemen, my family, all of them were killed in May 1944 in Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss had a daughter. She was a beautiful girl. She too was a poster child for the Third Reich. She was actually a catwalk model. And she modeled in Spain after the war. But she also lived her life in total denial. She believed that her father was completely innocent, in spite of the fact that he confessed to the crime. And she maintains that it was the British that tortured him for a confession. She absolutely refused to believe that her father was capable of such slaughter. This is what she said: how could there be so many survivors if so many had been killed? But Rudolf Höss also had a grandson, and this is him. This grandson, interesting story, was the one who said that he lived with guilt most of his life over the evilness, the iniquity of his grandfather. This is the man, I don't know if you could see on his chest, he has a Star of David on his chest, and he has inscribed, "Never forget." Reinhard Heydrich was one who reached out to Holocaust survivors, one in particular. If you've seen this face before, very famous woman, Eva Moses Kor. Eva Moses Kor was one of a set of twins that was experimented on by Josef Mengele. She and her sister Miriam were injected with germs to see how their bodies would react. Eva Moses Kor became famous at a later date because of her reaching out to the perpetrators or the children of perpetrators, wanting to reconcile and wanting to forgive them. And sure enough, the one that she found was Reinhard Heydrich, the grandson of the commandant of Auschwitz, where she and her sister were tortured, and where her mother, her father, and her family were killed. She went so far as to actually symbolically adopt Reinhard Heydrich. Sound good? Sound interesting? Well, we come to find out that Reinhard Heydrich is a career criminal. Reinhard Heydrich was denounced by his own brother, who was a priest, and said that his brother was only using the ashes of those killed at Auschwitz to profit by himself. and don't you know, after Eva Moses Corps adopted Rainier Huss, there was a fundraiser to start to create a film called Grandson, the story of Rainier Huss and his grandfather Rudolf. Rainier Huss took the money, something in the neighborhood of $25,000, and he hasn't been seen since. Eva Moses Corps, who died in 2019, disowned him. And this is her in a famous image of the children. This is she was one of the 320 Jewish children who were living at the time of the Russian liberation of Auschwitz. This is her pointing to her picture, this famous picture. We now come to the third most powerful man in the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler. He was called a butcher. And he said this: all of us can be happy and thankful that once in 1,000 years that fate has given us from among the German peoples such a genius, a leader, our Führer, Adolf Hitler. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and he was a chief of the SS. Heinrich Himmler was responsible for the Schutzstaffel, the SS. This is what he said in 1943. This is what he said to his troops. He said, "I want to mention a very difficult subject before you, completely openly. I'm talking about the extermination of the Jewish people. It is our plan. We're eliminating the Jews. No small matter." This is Heinrich Himmler. And of course, this is Himmler in 1945. As you know, Himmler escaped from Berlin. He presumably betrayed Adolf Hitler by trying to reach out to the Allies to negotiate some kind of peace agreement, some kind of surrender, after which Adolf Hitler said that both Himmler and Goering were traitors. This is what Himmler said: "We don't waste much time on the Jews. The more that die, the better. I hope to see the very concept of Jewry completely obliterated." But Himmler had a daughter. Gudrun Himmler was considered a princess of Nazism. She was a devoted Nazi her entire life. She was also one that had images of her father throughout her house. This was a woman that absolutely would not, she and her own mother were fervent Nazis. And this is the image that shows her, just like Edda Goering, being the princess of the Third Reich. But Gudrun Himmler also had a relative, a great niece of Heinrich Himmler, and her name was Katrin. Katrin Himmler only spoke once, but was another child that lived her entire life with the guilt, the shame, the fear of having her name associated with her great uncle. She says, "I don't believe that I inherited his badness, but I live with his name. When I was 11 years old, watching a TV series on the Holocaust, I sat at my desk crying because the name Himmler was repeated again and again. I realized that he was the worst mass murderer of modern times. But I am not responsible." Finally, we come to the man Hans Frank. Hans Frank's position was the Governor General of occupied Poland. As you know, Poland was invaded in 1938, 39, and when Poland was occupied, he was placed in charge of the governor of the protectorate of Poland. The largest, if you've been to Poland and if you've been to the 6 death camps in Poland, you cannot leave there without thinking that Poland is just one slaughterhouse. The site of mass murder, not just inside the camps, but in open fields. And this was the man, and you must know, these decisions weren't made by a single individual. Everyone I talked about met together to make these decisions. The decision to deport to Auschwitz 450,000 Hungarian Jews to Poland. The decision to murder 800 gypsy children. The decision to switch from carbon monoxide gas to hydrogen cyanide gas. Zyklon B gas. Why? Because carbon monoxide took an hour to kill everybody in a gas chamber. But Zyklon B took 20 minutes. It was people like this that made those decisions. And this was a man that confessed to doing it. But here's what he had to say before his capture. We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them and wherever it is possible in order to maintain the structure of the Reich as a whole. This is an image on the right of him sitting 2 people away from Hitler. He said, Hitler is lonely. So is God. Hitler is God. And here, a famous photograph of Hans Frank after his hanging. And here is the one child of a Nazi leader that probably struggled and was more aggressive in grappling with his ancestry. This is Nicholas Frank. Unlike all of the children I've talked about, Nicholas Frank spent his life researching, repudiating, and renouncing his father. He recalls when his father would laugh at the sight of prisoners being tortured. He remembers that. Hans Frank said this of his father, my father deserved to die. He committed the most horrible crimes. He was a mass murderer. This man, Nicholas Frank, the image, this picture here, he carries this photograph with him everywhere. Sounds strange? When asked why he does that, Nicholas Frank says, I carry it with me because of the way it portrays my father, dead. And when he speaks to audiences about the evil doings of his father, he says he feels like he is himself executing his father again. I have never managed in my life to get rid of the memory of him. I live with this deep shame about what he did. My father loved Hitler more than he loved his family. Here is another example of a man whose mother never called him Nicholas. His mother gave him a German name, Fremde. Those of you that speak German, Fremde, stranger. His own mother used the label, the German word stranger, referring to Nicholas Frank. I dream of the piles of corpses in the camps. My country will never be rid of that history. It's a story that was still not over. He wrote this book in the shadow of the Third Reich. This man has reached out to survivors, the children of survivors, wanting to bring together the children of perpetrators with the children of survivors, wanting to reconcile, wanting to share the very same feelings of depression that both suffer. Survivors, the children of survivors, the children of perpetrators. This is a man that today speaks to young German boys, young men that are unemployed, that are desperate, that are poor, that are ripe for recruitment by neo-Nazi groups. This man is devoting his life to doing. This man is one that is seeking to redeem the evil deeds of his father. So I'm going to end this talk with what I've learned in the year that I've spent studying this. The sons and daughters of powerful Nazi leaders were children of privilege. I'm letting you know that so that you know that they were children at the time they did not know. They could not. But eventually all of them would. And the range of reactions to the irrefutable evidence of the iniquity of their fathers was from total admiration, such as a Gudrun Himmler, such as an Edda Goering, to pure hatred. Such was the case with Nicholas Frank. Nicholas Frank's brother never accepted what his father confessed to. What happened with the children of Nazi leaders was that it divided their families. It divided siblings. It divided generations. But they coped nonetheless. And imagine living with that knowledge. Most of these children did not speak up and have anything to say about it until they were old. Because the best and perhaps the only way to cope with that was not to talk about it. But not talking about it didn't obviate not thinking about it. And we'll never know what thoughts they lived with. What I've shared with you mostly about the dreadful things their fathers did was what little we know. Most of them are gone. Not unlike Holocaust survivors. It's people like me and the Gross Family Center that continue to emphasize the importance of Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance, in programs like this. And yet you know and I know the depth of the ignorance of the Holocaust. The other thing I learned about my study of these children of Nazi war criminals is that a lot of them, like us, probably never thought that that kind of evil could come so close to us. When we think that somebody's committed an atrocity, it's always got to be somebody else. Which is why I say here that the evil that's related to you, the evil related to us, is always the hardest to see and the easiest to deny. There are none so blind as those who won't see. The evil that is so close to us is the easiest to deny and the hardest to see. We all have the same question. Can you really love someone who committed crimes so heinous as this if you honestly know what they did and what they thought. All of us have to wonder. Imagine, what would you think if you found out that your neighbor was a descendant of a mass murderer? This is the question. Are the sins of the fathers visited upon their children? For how many generations? Can the children be held responsible? They may deny what their fathers had done, but should we perceive them, should we treat them differently for the deeds of their fathers? The same question can be asked of parents. Should parents suffer the consequences of the evilness of their children? This is where the question in Torah comes up about not only do children inherit the consequences of sin, but the seeds of sin. Thank you all very much for coming to this talk today.